The Nevada heat pressed down like a heavy blanket as Captain Evelyn Shaw stepped onto the tarmac at Nellis Air Force Base. Her weathered flight boots scraped against concrete baked white by relentless sun and jet exhaust. She wore a faded olive flight suit, zipped to the collar despite the oppressive temperature, her shoulder-length blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that caught the desert wind. In her left hand, she carried a worn canvas flight bag that had seen more missions than most pilots. In her right, a handwritten flight card, the old-fashioned kind that younger aviators had replaced with digital tablets years ago. The card was bent slightly from the moisture of her palm, evidence of nerves she'd never admit to feeling. The flight line stretched before her like a showcase of American air power. Sleek F-35 Lightning jets gleamed under spotlights, their composite wings and fresh mission-ready paint jobs designed to impress visiting foreign dignitaries. Advanced C-17 Globemasters sat in perfect formation, their hulking frames polished to mirror finish. Her aircraft sat alone at the far edge of the strip, a battle-scarred C-130 Hercules that looked like a relic from another era. The matte, grey paint had faded and flaked in patches, revealing the bare metal underneath like old scars. While other planes basked in the attention of ground crews and maintenance teams, hers sat in solitary neglect. "You lost, ma'am," called a ground technician, without warmth, squinting at her through oil-stained sunglasses. His tone carried the casual dismissal reserved for those who clearly didn't belong. Another voice followed from near a fuel truck. "Maybe she's here to fix coffee for the real pilots." The comment sparked scattered laughter from nearby airmen who barely glanced in her direction. Evelyn offered no response. She kept walking toward the logistics tent with measured steps, her face betraying nothing. At the check-in counter, a junior officer took her flight card without meeting her eyes. One glance at the handwritten details and his expression shifted to barely concealed contempt. "You're not on the manifest," he said flatly, letting the card flutter to the desk as he turned away to grab another clipboard. Behind her, the laughter flared again, sharp and dismissive. She didn't speak. She simply walked back across the strip, past alternating patches of shadow and blazing sunlight, and stopped beside her aircraft. No one followed. No one cared enough to follow. Inside the mobile command unit, tension hung in the air like smoke. A whiteboard displayed 3 thick red X's, each marked next to a failed flight number. Beneath them, a smaller line read, "Operation Canyon Drop. Pending." The air was thick with humidity from sweat, radio heat, and the kind of frustration that comes when pride meets repeated failure. Men moved between consoles with sharp, brittle energy. Voices crackled over radios reporting another failed supply drop to isolated troops trapped in hostile terrain. 3 elite crews had attempted the dangerous canyon mission. 3 had returned empty-handed, citing impossible conditions and equipment failures. Evelyn Shaw stood just inside the tent entrance, unnoticed for nearly a full minute, until a staff sergeant glanced up from his console. "If you're here for the evacuation briefing, that's downrange at Operations 2, he said, thumbing toward another tent already sagging from overuse. "I'm here to fly," she replied quietly. He blinked in confusion. "Fly what?" "My aircraft." The C-130, Major Daniel Keene's voice, cut through the humid air like a blade. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, his uniform crisp despite the heat, his bearing radiating the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "You're not on the current manifest. You're not cleared for active support operations. That aircraft hasn't been rated for canyon drift missions since the last terrain reclassification." Evelyn held out a flight sheet with updated configuration details. Keene barely glanced at it. We've got qualified teams in the sky already. 3 failures don't mean we throw protocol out the window and let museum pieces take over. Behind her, a younger pilot in a pristine flight suit laughed. His custom squadron patch gleamed over his breast pocket, and his confidence radiated the swagger of someone who'd never faced real failure. "What's next?" he called out. "Bring out the World War II birds?" Nostalgia in a flight suit reporting for duty. More chuckles followed, low, relieved laughter that gave the room something to lean on instead of facing their mounting failures. In that moment, Evelyn realized something that would fuel everything that followed. They weren't just dismissing her capabilities, they were afraid of what it might mean if the overlooked woman with the old plane succeeded where their elite crews had failed. She placed the flight sheet on the edge of a folding table and walked out of the tent. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the northern horizon, dark, close, and unforgiving. Time was running out for the troops who needed those supplies. But Evelyn Shaw had spent her entire career being overlooked. Today, that would finally change. The storm front loomed closer as Evelyn sat on the cargo ramp of her C-130 watching the chaos unfold around her. The base hummed with frustrated energy as officers scrambled to find solutions to their impossible mission. 3 elite flight crews had returned with tales of devastating crosswinds, equipment malfunctions, and terrain too dangerous for standard drop procedures. Her canvas-bound flight manual lay open across her lap, its pages yellowed and curled at the corners. In the margins, her initials ES appeared beside hand-drawn trajectory curves and altitude compensation formulas. Calculations she'd worked out through years of flying missions others deemed impossible. The fuselage around her bore the faded ghost of an old squadron insignia, and a line of rivets along the cargo bay door had been buffed so smooth they felt like silk under her palm. This aircraft wasn't just her assignment, it was her partner, in a career spent proving that experience could overcome technology. Across the tarmac, Major Keane pointed aggressively at a canyon relief map while raising his voice to a small group of officers. "We don't have clearance to wait for miracles. Either we execute this mission in the next 90 minutes, or we issue a fallback order and call the zone unsupplied." A logistics technician glanced toward Evelyn, then quickly looked away. No one wanted to acknowledge the obvious solution sitting 20 yards from their heated discussions. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, barely old enough to legally drink, passed by her aircraft carrying a stack of equipment manuals. He caught sight of her weathered flight guide and smirked. "Where'd you dig that relic up?" They scanned the updated version into the drop system years ago. His tone carried the condescension of someone who'd learned everything from simulators and nothing from experience. Evelyn flipped a page and continued reading. Her silence seemed to irritate him more than any response could have. "Good luck finding anything useful in that paperback museum piece," he added with a short laugh before walking away. The wind picked up, lifting dust in small whirlwinds near the supply stacks. 2 medics walked past carrying empty medical crates, their faces grim and silent. They'd just returned from the forward operating base, the same base waiting desperately for the supplies that no one could deliver. A voice crackled over the emergency channel, thin and strained. "Fob Delta calling base. We've got 24 hours of rations remaining. Water reserves at 50%. Any update on resupply status would be appreciated." The line went quiet. No one answered because no one had good news to share. Inside the logistics trailer, the conversation had devolved into frustrated circles. Flight officers recycled the same failed plans, their voices taking on the hollow ring of people who'd run out of viable options. "We can't authorize another attempt without proper clearance," one officer insisted. "The only available airframe is—" He stopped short, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air like an accusation. They all knew, they all saw her sitting there. But admitting they needed the woman they'd dismissed meant acknowledging their own failures. Outside, Evelyn stood and folded her manual shut. Her thumb lingered on her initials for a moment, a small gesture that contained decades of missions flown in the shadows of more celebrated pilots. She slid the manual into her pack and walked up the cargo ramp. The sun was lower now, painting the distant mountains in shades of gold and red. She reached up and gripped the edge of the cargo bay, testing a load strap with a slow, methodical pull. Everything was solid, ready, waiting. She walked inside her aircraft, her figure disappearing into the shadow of the cargo hold. Behind her, the runway lights flickered on as the stormline edged closer. The only sound that followed was the groan of wind against metal as Evelyn began her pre-flight checks alone. No one called out to stop her. No one even noticed she'd begun preparing for the mission they claimed was impossible. But in 20 minutes, when her engines roared to life without authorization, they'd finally understand what they'd been overlooking all along. The woman who never demanded respect was about to earn it the hard way by succeeding where everyone else had failed. The emergency radio crackled again. Fob Delta to base. Storms moving in fast. If anyone's coming, now would be good. Evelyn Shaw was coming. She just hadn't asked permission first. The cargo bay of the C-130 felt like a cathedral in the growing darkness, vast, echoing, and sacred in its purpose. Evelyn moved through her preparations with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that success lived in the details. Everyone else overlooked. The supply pallet sat centered in the bay, strapped down with her own hands using techniques that had become muscle memory over 2 decades of flying. Each tie-down was checked twice, each connection tested with the slow, deliberate pressure that separated professionals from pretenders. The parachute rig attached to the pallet was older than most of the crew on base, packed by memory rather than digital readout, adjusted by feel rather than computer algorithm. Evelyn crouched beside the deployment mechanism and turned the timing knob slowly, watching the mechanical counter tick forward. 5 seconds. No automation, no override systems, just airspeed, timing, and the kind of instinct that couldn't be taught in simulators. Outside, the base stirred with increasing urgency. Radio chatter hissed through the air. Status lights clicked from amber to red across the flight line. The third weather alert of the evening chimed from the control tower, warning of deteriorating conditions in the target zone. In the command tent, officers huddled in tight circles of indecision. Maps were spread and respread across folding tables. The same failed flight plans were discussed and discarded for the 4th time in an hour. A final, desperate request had just come in from the forward operating base. Urgent, strained, carrying the weight of lives hanging in the balance. The zone still needed the supply drop. No airframes were officially cleared. No crew was officially willing to risk their careers on an unauthorized mission. Evelyn didn't wait for official clearance. Her boots hit the cargo ramp with a decisive thud as she walked toward the cockpit. Her hair was tied tight against the growing wind, sleeves pushed back to her elbows in preparation for work that demanded complete focus. The flight card sat beside the throttle lever, unsigned and unstamped by the bureaucracy that had tried to erase her, but folded neatly with the care of someone who understood that small details determined big outcomes. She placed it under the edge of the instrument panel, a quiet acknowledgement of the system that had overlooked her value. Her fingers found the ignition switches with practiced ease. The C-130's engines turned over with a reluctant groan. 1, then 2, then all four cylinders roaring to life in a symphony of controlled power that rippled across the flight line like thunder made mechanical. The ground around her aircraft shimmered with heat and dust. Nearby technicians turned toward the unexpected sound, their conversations stopping mid-sentence. One reached for his radio, hesitated as he processed what he was witnessing, then slowly lowered it without making the call. No one moved to stop her. The moment had arrived when action would speak louder than authority, when results would matter more than regulations. Inside the command center, a controller looked up sharply from his console. Is she actually moving that aircraft? The young officer beside him froze, his training manual open to procedures that had never covered this situation. She doesn't have clearance. That aircraft isn't on the authorized roster for tonight's operations. Call it in, the controller ordered, but his voice lacked conviction. They all knew what the call would accomplish. Nothing. The woman who'd been dismissed all day was now taking action while they continued to discuss and debate. Evelyn began taxiing forward, her aircraft moving with the deliberate pace of someone who'd made peace with the consequences of doing what needed to be done. The tower erupted in radio chatter. Unscheduled movement on runway Delta 2. Advise immediate. Shutdown. You do not have clearance for takeoff. No response from the C-130's radio. A second voice, sharper and more frustrated, cut through the frequency. C-130 on active taxiway. Stand down immediately or face disciplinary action. This is a direct order. Still nothing. The hulking aircraft continued its slow turn onto the active runway, deliberate and unstoppable as a force of nature. A junior officer jogged toward the aircraft, then stopped, caught in the crosswinds of its passing. Evelyn didn't glance down from her cockpit. Her attention was focused entirely forward, on the mission, the storm, and the troops who were counting on someone to break through when breaking through seemed impossible. Inside the cockpit, switches flipped under her fingers with the fluid, grace of a pianist playing a familiar concerto. Her face remained calm, the lines of her jaw set, but not rigid. The engine vibration traveled up through her boots into her spine, connecting her to the aircraft in a way that no amount of training could replicate. She read wind direction from the tower flags and ignored the forecasted turbulence warnings scrolling across her weather display. There was no co-pilot to confirm her decisions, no navigator to double-check her calculations, just the cargo, her hands, and the storm-dark sky waiting beyond the runway. One final call buzzed through her headset. You are not cleared for a takeoff. Do you copy? Evelyn reached for the communications switch, her hand hovering over it for a moment that contained entire conversations about duty, protocol, and the difference between following orders and doing what was right. Then she let her hand fall to the throttle instead. The C-130 surged down the runway like a metal beast awakening from decades of slumber. The sound built from a mechanical growl into thunder wrapped in steel, echoing off the hangars and shaking windows across the base. Inside the cockpit, Evelyn felt every rivet and bolt trembling with strain as the aircraft approached takeoff speed. The old airframe rattled in ways that would terrify younger pilots, but Evelyn recognized each vibration as a familiar conversation between pilot and machine. The nose wheel lifted first, followed by the main landing gear in a moment that felt like breaking free from gravity itself. She pulled back gently on the yoke, coaxing rather than commanding the aircraft into the air. The C-130 rose low over the base, hugging the tree line like a ghost, navigating by muscle memory rather than instruments. In the cargo bay, overhead lights flickered as she banked gently south toward the storm-shrouded mountains. The temperature in the cockpit dropped as she gained altitude. Evelyn leveled out at 8,000 feet, checked her heading against the compass, and gave one last glance to the folded flight card. Then she slid it back into her jacket pocket. A small act of defiance. That felt larger than the unauthorized takeoff itself. The radio channels had gone silent. No more desperate orders crackling through her headset. No more threats of disciplinary action. Just the steady hum of engines and the whisper of wind over aluminum skin. Below her, the base stood frozen in a moment of collective realization. The woman they'd dismissed had taken action while they'd continued to debate. On the ground, officers remained frozen at their consoles. The aircraft was gone, carrying with it their last hope for mission success and their assumptions about who deserved to be taken seriously. For the first time all day, no one had anything left to say. The canyon rose ahead like the open jaws of some prehistoric creature, its walls jagged and steep with narrow shadows clinging to their folds. Wind streamed off the rocks in invisible sheets, turning the air into a shifting maze of turbulence that had defeated 3 previous attempts. Evelyn flew in low, skimming just above the tree line, where radar coverage was spotty and where she could feel the terrain's influence on the aircraft. There were no beacon pings guiding her approach, no GPS coordinates uploaded to her navigation system, no radioed elevation checks from ground controllers. Just the landscape itself and her. Memory of its contours. She adjusted the flaps manually, feeling the control stick resist her input as crosswinds hit the aircraft like invisible fists. The right wing dipped suddenly as a downdraft caught her, but she corrected with a nudge of rudder and throttle that kept the C-130 level despite the air's attempt to throw her against the canyon walls. The cockpit shuddered under the strain of flight at the edge of the aircraft's capabilities. One loose panel above her left shoulder rattled with a sharp metallic whine that spoke of age and wear, but also of an aircraft that had survived worse conditions than this. Daylight was failing fast. Sunlight struck the canyon rim at an angle too steep to illuminate her flight path, leaving her to navigate by the shifting patterns of shadow and the glimpses of terrain visible between rock outcroppings and brush-covered ridges. She reached for the stopwatch clipped to her flight harness, its glass face cracked from years of use but still functional, still reliable when digital systems might fail. In the cargo bay behind her, the supply pallet sat in the glow of a single overhead strip light, rigged with a scarlet parachute that had been folded by hand and measured without templates. The parachute's color had faded at the edges, but the stitching was fresh, reinforced during her pre-flight preparations. She had tied each deployment strap herself, checked each connection twice, and calculated exactly how long the chute would take to open, stabilize, and guide its precious cargo to the troops waiting below. Evelyn exhaled slowly and scanned the ridgeline ahead. The wind shifted again and a tremor rolled through the aircraft. Not dramatic, just a sudden pocket of air gone missing beneath her left wing. She compensated with the kind of micro-adjustments that separated experienced pilots from skilled ones, keeping her aircraft stable in conditions that had forced others to abandon their missions. Down below, hidden somewhere beyond the tree line, was the makeshift landing zone, a flattened patch marked by tarps and signal die barely wide enough for a successful drop. No electronic targeting system could guide her to it. No confirmation beacon would tell her when she'd found it. Just a margin of guesswork the size of a dining room table and the kind of precision that came from flying by instinct rather than instruments. She keyed the cargo bay door release. The lever caught once before unlocking with a mechanical groan that she felt through the aircraft's frame. Behind her, the rear ramp began lowering, letting in the cold rush of wind and transforming the enclosed hum of flight into an exposed roar of speed and air pressure. The supply crate stood alone in the cargo bay, its restraining straps taut with tension. She watched its edges vibrate as the slipstream pressed through the open cargo door, turning her aircraft into a delivery system balanced on the knife's edge between success and catastrophe. No sound reached her from the ground below. No signal. Flare marked her target. Just her own sense of distance, timing, and the kind of flying that happened when technology stepped aside and let experience take control. Evelyn began counting backward from 5, her eyes locked on the terrain below, watching for the way shadows broke against that one distinctive shelf of rock, the scatter of treetops that marked her reference point. She adjusted her speed slightly, nose down 1/2 degree, left wing tipped to compensate for wind drift. 4. She touched the edge of her cracked stopwatch, feeling its familiar weight against her flight suit. 3. The canyon walls pressed, close on both sides as Evelyn entered the final phase of her approach. A loose tree branch, torn free by the wind, blew past her cockpit window like a dark bird riding the same currents that threatened to dash her aircraft against the rocks. 2. She placed her right hand on the cargo release mechanism. Fingers curled around the handle with the gentle firmness of someone who understood that success and failure often separated by the smallest margins of timing and pressure. 1. She pulled. The supply crate shot backwards on its rails, the magnetic locks disengaging with a hard, metallic snap that she felt through her boots. The slipstream caught the deployment chute instantly, yanking it from the cargo bay like a scarlet flower, blooming in fast forward. For 1/2 second, the parachute flared wide, then collapsed as the air pressure overwhelmed its initial deployment. Then it bloomed open properly, a brilliant red canopy against the dark shadows of the canyon, visible and stable and perfect. The crate lurched once as the chute took full hold, corrected its orientation, spun once in mid-air, then steadied into a controlled descent that looked almost peaceful from her vantage point 500 feet above. From the cockpit, the falling supply pallet looked like a red speck descending through silence toward a target she couldn't see. The drop field was hidden by treetops and the slope of the canyon, but she could read the angle of descent, the wind correction built into the chute's drift, the steady stabilization that meant her calculations had been exactly right. She keyed, the cargo bay door controls raising the rear ramp to seal the roar of wind back into the familiar hum of enclosed flight. The mechanical sounds of the door sealing felt like closing a chapter. The mission phase was complete. Now came the careful work of getting home. Her hands returned to the flight controls with practiced efficiency. She eased the throttle forward and began a long, slow climb out of the canyon, feeling the C-130 respond grudgingly, like an old horse being asked for one more effort after a long day's work. The altimeter ticked steadily upward as the canyon walls dropped away behind her. The sky opened up into clear air above the weather system, revealing stars that had been hidden by the storm clouds. She touched the edge of the cockpit panel where the metal had been worn smooth by countless hands resting in the same spot, a small gesture that connected her to every pilot who'd ever flown this aircraft into impossible places. For a moment, she left her hand there, palm down, fingers relaxed, feeling the vibration of engines that had carried her through another mission that others had declared unflyable. Then she pulled back on the controls, leveled out at cruising altitude, and began the flight home. Below her, hidden in the shadows of the canyon, no one knew her name. But the supply crate had landed exactly where it needed to be, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The troops who'd been waiting for medical supplies and rations wouldn't care about the politics of her unauthorized flight. They'd only care that someone had finally broken through when breaking through mattered most. The first radio transmission came through faint and clipped, a medic's voice speaking from the forward operating base with the calm professionalism of someone who'd learned not to get excited about good news until it was confirmed. Base, this is FOB Delta. We have visual contact with the supply drop. Pallet landed intact, no apparent damage. Medical supplies and rations are being distributed now. There was a long pause before the next transmission, as if everyone listening needed time to process that the impossible mission had actually succeeded. Another voice confirmed from a different location. FOB Delta, this is Overwatch 7. We observed the drop sequence. Clean deployment, minimal drift, target acquired. Outstanding work by whoever made that run. The praise hung in the radio frequency like an accusation. Everyone listening knew that the outstanding work had been performed by the pilot they'd refused to authorize flying the aircraft they deemed unfit for the mission. Inside the base command center, no one looked up from their consoles. A captain clicked his pen twice, crossed out the red X beside Operation Canyon Drop on the whiteboard, and wrote nothing in its place. The successful mission would exist in the official record as an anomaly, a statistical correction that happened without explanation or attribution. One of the elite pilots who'd failed the morning's attempt stood by the tent exit with his helmet tucked under his arm, staring at the floor with the expression of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew about flying, without a word. To his colleagues, he stepped outside and walked toward the flight line. He never returned to the command post that night. The shift change happened quietly, completely. New controllers took over the radio frequencies, new officers assumed command responsibilities, and the failed mission that had consumed the base's attention for 12 hours simply became a successful supply drop that no one wanted to discuss in detail. Out on the flight line, Evelyn's C-130 sat near the center of the taxiway now, moved and reparked by ground crews who'd acted without specific orders. The aircraft was no longer hidden along the forgotten edges of the base. The hangar floodlights caught its rough metal skin and gave it new dignity, the respect accorded to machines that delivered when it mattered most. No one approached the aircraft directly, but a mechanic walked past carrying a thermos of hot coffee. He set it down beside the cargo ramp without ceremony. No label, no note, just placed there with the careful attention of someone who understood that some gestures spoke louder than words. The thermos sat there like a small monument to competence, waiting for the pilot who'd reminded everyone what flying was really about. Evelyn sat on the wing of her C-130, one leg draped over the edge, the other propped beneath her as she leaned against the fuselage. The metal was still warm from the desert day, and the familiar feel of it against her back was more comforting than any debriefing room could have been. Her flight report was spread across her lap, not because anyone had requested it, but because that's what professional pilots did after missions that mattered. She wrote slowly in black ink, using block letters that were precise and exact. Each entry matched the timestamp on her cracked stopwatch, creating a record that no one would read officially, but that would stand as proof of what had actually happened tonight. The base around her had transformed in subtle ways. The sharp tension that had defined the day had softened into something else. Not quite reverence, but a careful watchfulness that suggested everyone was reassessing what they thought they knew about the quiet pilot and her battered aircraft. A junior airman crossed the tarmac carrying 2 clipboards, his usual route taking him past her plane. He paused, glanced around to see if anyone was watching, then quietly adjusted the daily flight manifest on his top sheet. Evelyn's aircraft. Code appeared in the margin, written in careful handwriting that wouldn't pass official scrutiny, but would be there for anyone who looked closely enough. Near the logistics tent, conversations had taken on a different tone. Voices lowered when she walked past, not from dismissal but from something approaching respect. A discussion stopped mid-sentence as she approached, then resumed with more measured words and less casual arrogance. Someone had moved a stack of supply crates to give her aircraft more clearance space, unprompted, unordered, just done because it seemed like the right thing to do. Another ground crew member nodded as she passed, unsure whether military protocol required a salute, but certain that some acknowledgement was appropriate. Inside the administrative trailer, Commander Patricia Hayes scanned the evening's dispatch. Summary. Her eye caught on an unmarked entry, Evelyn's flight number, written by hand in the margin of the official log. Hayes was a 20-year veteran who'd learned to read between the lines of military bureaucracy. She knew what the handwritten entry meant. Someone had completed a mission that officially never happened, using an aircraft that wasn't supposed to be capable of the work, succeeding where authorized crews had failed. Hayes reached for her pen and signed the bottom of the dispatch page without comment or correction. The signature made the entire log official, including the marginalia that would ensure Evelyn's flight existed in the permanent record. Outside, the airstrip was quieter than it had been in days. The sharp edges of failure and frustration had dulled into something more contemplative. Personnel moved with less urgency, spoke with less volume, and carried themselves with the subdued energy of people who'd witnessed something that challenged their assumptions about how things were supposed to work. No one used Evelyn's name in their conversations, but no one looked past her anymore either. She'd become visible not through self-promotion or political maneuvering, but through the simple act of delivering results when results seemed impossible. Evelyn folded her handwritten flight report and tucked it into her canvas bag. She slid off the wing with practiced ease, her boots landing in the dust with a soft thud that seemed to carry more weight than it should have. The thermos left by the anonymous mechanic sat beside the cargo ramp like an offering. She picked it up, turned it once in her hands to feel its warmth, then carried it up the ramp into her aircraft. The cargo bay lights flickered on with a soft, electronic whine as she settled cross-legged on the bay floor, the thermos beside her, her flight bag at her feet. No one came to thank her directly. The mission had been unauthorized after all, and official gratitude would raise uncomfortable questions about why authorization had been withheld in the first place. But she didn't need formal recognition to understand what had changed. She had been there when the base needed someone who could fly through impossible conditions. She had succeeded when their best and brightest had returned with excuses. She had demonstrated the difference between following procedures and achieving objectives. Now she sat alone in the aircraft that had carried her through another mission others couldn't complete. She was still the same woman they'd dismissed that morning, but she was no longer invisible. The transformation hadn't happened through politics or promotion, but through the kind of competence that spoke for itself when words weren't enough. Outside her aircraft, the base continued its evening routine with one significant difference. The quiet pilot with the old C-130 was no longer someone to be overlooked. She was someone to be reckoned with. The change was subtle but unmistakable, respect earned through action rather than demanded through rank. Recognition that came not from what she said, but from what she delivered when delivery mattered most. And in the military culture that valued results above rhetoric, that kind of recognition was worth more than any medal or commendation that could be pinned to a uniform. 3 days after the canyon drop, a brief mention appeared in a regional military column filed by a correspondent covering routine logistics operations. Buried in the middle of a longer piece about supply chain challenges, a single sentence read, "An older C-130 aircraft successfully completed the final supply run, where 3 previous attempts had failed due to adverse conditions." No names were mentioned, no aircraft numbers specified, just a clinical acknowledgement that someone had succeeded where others hadn't. Most readers would have skipped past it entirely, but one person didn't. Retired Air Force historian Dr. Robert Chen was researching vintage aircraft performance data when the phrase older C-130 caught his attention. He pulled a collection of outdated training manuals from his personal library and flipped to the section on Canyon flight procedures. There, in faded print, was a handwritten notation. Adjusted timing interval per ES manual override, Canyon model approach. The initials ES appeared in several places throughout the manual, always beside calculations that seemed to anticipate problems the official procedures didn't address. Chen had seen similar annotations in other vintage training materials, the kind of practical modifications that experienced pilots made when textbook solutions weren't enough. He scanned the pages and uploaded them to a military history forum, noting the gap between theoretical training and real-world application. The post would have disappeared into internet obscurity if not for what happened next. A grainy training video began circulating among flight instructor networks. Archived footage from a long-forgotten logistics server that showed canyon terrain from a cockpit perspective. No faces appeared in the clip, no identifying information, but the voice narrating over the footage was steady and unmistakably competent. This is where you trust, feel over forecast. You're not flying through numbers or algorithms, you're flying through memory, through experience that can't be programmed or simulated. People began asking questions about the voice. Someone with access to old training archives matched the audio to previous instructional recordings. Sessions from back when canyon insertion techniques were still taught without computer assistance. The name that appeared in the metadata wasn't listed on any current faculty roster or recent award citation, but it was there, Evelyn Shaw. Flight instructor forums picked up the story. Then advanced pilot training courses. Young aviators began mentioning her name the way rock climbers talk about free solo specialists, with admiration edged by disbelief that anyone would attempt what she routinely accomplished. Flight schools across 3 different bases quietly added a new element to their canyon training modules. They called it the Shaw interval, a timing adjustment that no one formally endorsed, but that instructors began teaching when standard procedures weren't sufficient for difficult terrain. A still photograph appeared on military aviation social media, a wide-angle shot of Evelyn's aircraft rolling down the runway, taken from base security camera footage and uploaded anonymously. The plane's matte finish and weathered silhouette looked almost ethereal against the polished concrete of the modern airbase. Someone captioned it, "She flew it anyway." The phrase spread through the military aviation community like a coded acknowledgement of pilots who didn't wait for perfect conditions or complete authorization to accomplish necessary missions. It appeared on hangar whiteboards typed in small font on the corners of squadron patches and scrawled in maintenance logbooks beside entries for aircraft that had exceeded their supposed limitations. No journalist ever interviewed Evelyn about the Canyon mission. No official articles were written about her contribution. She didn't respond to the few requests that made their way through official channels, and she never appeared at any symposiums or training conferences. But the hangar where she maintained her aircraft began drawing quiet visitors. Military academy cadets walked past more slowly during base tours. Veterans from old transport wings stood in the hangar's shadow with long silences that spoke of recognition and respect. There was no formal commemoration, no plaque or official designation. But people lingered. They came to see the aircraft that had succeeded when success seemed impossible, flown by the pilot who'd reminded everyone what competence looked like when stripped of politics and procedure. An airman from the latest training rotation found an old flight logbook tucked into a side cabinet near Evelyn's maintenance station. The entries were handwritten in the same precise block letters she used for official reports, documenting hundreds of missions that had never made headlines but had always delivered results. The signature at the bottom of each entry read E. Shaw, mission complete. He didn't file the logbook with base archives. Instead, he scanned several pages and posted them once on a veterans forum, then carefully placed the logbook back exactly where he'd found it. The images circulated quietly among people who understood what they were looking at, a record of competence that spoke louder than any commendation or promotion ever could. But Evelyn herself remained elusive. She was spotted once more by a maintenance chief during an early morning inspection weeks after the Canyon mission. She wore the same faded flight suit, carried the same canvas bag, and methodically checked the same engine components on her C-130 that she'd been checking for years. She left no note, spoke to no one, and by the time anyone thought to approach her for conversation, the aircraft had been moved to a different section of the base. Her hangar space stood empty, except for a small piece of yellow notepaper taped to the back wall near the electrical switchboard. In block print, someone had written, "No clearance needed when you're already over the target." The quote was misattributed to a training officer in the official rumor mill, but everyone who saw it knew exactly who it belonged to, and no one took it down. The note remained there long after Evelyn Shaw had moved on to whatever mission came next, a small monument to the pilot who'd proved that the most important flights often happen when no one thinks to grant permission for takeoff. The runway stretched empty in the desert morning, heat already beginning to shimmer off the tarmac despite the early hour. A faded windsock hung limp from its mast, catching occasional gusts that made it snap with a sound that echoed off the distant hangars before fading into silence. Evelyn's C-130 sat alone near the edge of the flight line, its weathered surface warmed by climbing sunlight. The aircraft looked older now, more deliberate in its stillness, but it had been meticulously maintained, cleaned, serviced, and prepared with the care reserved for machines that had proven their worth when it mattered most. The cargo ramp was lowered halfway, casting a long shadow across the concrete like a threshold between the world of bureaucracy and regulations and the place where missions got completed regardless of official approval. She moved around the aircraft with quiet efficiency, checking tire pressure with the thoroughness of someone who understood that small oversights could become large problems at altitude. She wiped accumulated grit from the engine intake seams and secured a single wooden crate in the cargo bay, unmarked, bolted shut, strapped down with the same meticulous attention she'd given to the Canyon mission supplies. A canvas pack hung across one shoulder, heavier than usual, suggesting personal belongings rather than just mission equipment. Her flight suit showed the honest wear of someone who'd spent decades in cockpits rather than briefing rooms, the fabric sun-faded at the seams and softened by countless flights into places other pilots wouldn't go. She paused near the wing, squinting into the desert wind that carried the scent of sage and jet fuel. Then she reached up and pressed her palm once against the undercarriage of the aircraft. Not a ceremonial gesture, just the kind of physical connection that experienced pilots maintained with machines that had carried them safely through impossible situations. Across the flight line, a young pilot in a fresh uniform watched from beside the base operations building. Lieutenant Rebecca Hayes had graduated first in her flight training class 6 months ago, full of confidence in modern avionics and digital flight systems. But she'd been at the base the night of the Canyon mission, had seen the older pilots succeed, where elite crews had failed. She didn't call out or wave. She simply stood still as Evelyn climbed the cargo ramp, recognizing that she was witnessing something significant. The departure of someone who'd redefined what competence looked like when stripped of rank and politics. Evelyn paused at the top of the ramp, not to look back at the base that had finally learned to respect her abilities, but to let the morning quiet settle around her one final time. The desert stretched in all directions, vast and unforgiving, and beautiful in its indifference to human ambition. Then the cargo door closed with the solid thunk of well-maintained machinery. The aircraft sat motionless for several minutes, engines silent, while its pilot completed the kind of thorough pre-flight check that had become second nature over 2 decades of flying missions others couldn't handle. No tower communication crackled through the radio frequencies. No flight plan had been filed with base operations. When the engines finally came alive, they did so with the deep, even rumble of mechanical systems that had been pushed to their limits and had never failed to deliver. The C-130 rolled forward with the purposeful weight of an aircraft that knew exactly where it was going. No clearance was requested, no lights flashed from the control tower. The wheels left the tarmac, and she lifted into the morning sky, steady and small against the pale blue vastness, climbing toward whatever destination had called her away from the base that had never quite known what to do with her talents. Lieutenant Hayes watched until the aircraft disappeared into the heat shimmer on the horizon. She'd learned more about flying from watching Evelyn Shaw's unauthorized canyon mission than she had from her entire formal training program. The lesson wasn't about breaking rules or ignoring authority. It was about understanding that competence spoke louder than credentials, that results mattered more than recognition, and that the most important missions often happened when someone simply decided to act instead of waiting for permission. Back in the hangar that had housed Evelyn's aircraft, the yellow note still clung to the wall. No clearance needed when you're already over the target. Maintenance crews worked around it without disturbing it, understanding that some messages were worth preserving. Evelyn Shaw had been overlooked, dismissed, and ignored throughout most of her career. Not because she lacked skill, but because she'd never demanded to be seen. She'd never raised her voice, never argued her worth, never campaigned for recognition or promotion. Instead, she had simply prepared, acted, and delivered when no one else could. She'd chosen precision over politics, competence over credentials, and mission accomplishment over personal advancement. In a world that often confused noise with substance, she demonstrated that quiet courage could accomplish what loud confidence couldn't. Her strength had come not from being recognized by others, but from knowing exactly who she was when no one was watching. The story of her unauthorized canyon mission would circulate for years among pilots who understood that flying wasn't just about following procedures, but about making decisions when procedures weren't enough. Young aviators would learn her name alongside the technical skills that kept aircraft in the sky, and some would remember that the most extraordinary achievements often happened far from spotlights and applause. She'd proven that being underestimated could be an advantage, that competence needed no announcement, and that sometimes the quietest flight left the deepest impression on everyone watching from the ground. Somewhere beyond the desert horizon, Evelyn Shaw continued flying toward whatever mission came next, carrying with her the knowledge that she'd reminded an entire airbase what professionalism looked like when measured by results rather than recognition. And for those left behind, her example would serve as a quiet reminder that excellence didn't require an audience. It just required someone willing to act when action mattered most. If you enjoyed this story about Evelyn Shaw's incredible journey from overlooked pilot to legendary aviator, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday life stories community. We share powerful tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it matters most. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever been underestimated like Evelyn? Share your own story of quiet courage in the comments.